No one in Red Mesa ever forgot the day 3 Apache sisters were dragged onto the auction. Block dust in their eyes, chains on their wrists, and hopelessness carved into their silence. They expected to be sold as property. They never expected the man who stepped forward, or the price he would pay to save them. The desert had a way of burning truth into a man's bones. It stripped away pretense, left only what mattered: water, shadow, and the will to see another sunrise. Red Mesa knew this better than most settlements sprawled across the New Mexico territory. It was a place where the law ended and something older, meaner, took its place. A town built on whiskey, bloodshed, and the kind of commerce that happened in shadows, away from the eyes of judges and marshals who might still believe in things like justice. The auction block stood in the center of what passed for a town square, a weathered platform of sun-bleached wood that had held everything from stolen cattle to firearms stripped from murdered soldiers. Today it held something darker, something that made even the hardened men who gathered swallow hard and checked their consciences at the door, assuming they'd brought any to begin with. 3 young women stood in chains. The eldest couldn't have been more than 25. She stood with her spine rigid despite the iron shackles that bit into her wrists, her black hair falling in tangled waves past her shoulders. Her eyes, dark as obsidian, swept across the crowd with undisguised contempt. If she was afraid, she buried it so deep that even the men who dragged her onto that platform couldn't find it. Pride radiated from her like heat shimmer off desert stone. Ayanna, the name meant eternal bloom, though there was nothing soft about her now. She was thorns and fire, a wild thing that hadn't learned how to be broken and never would. Beside her stood the middle sister, perhaps 2 years younger. Where Ayanna blazed, this one smoldered. Kaya moved less, spoke less, existed in a state of watchful stillness that made her seem carved from the same clay as the mesas themselves. Her eyes tracked everything: the position of the guards, the weapons on display, the shifting mood of the crowd. She cataloged threat and opportunity with the precision of someone who learned young that survival meant never missing a detail. Something had happened to her before this day. Something that had taught her to observe rather than act, to endure rather than fight. The trauma lived in her silence, in the way she flinched when men moved too quickly, in how her breathing became shallow when the auctioneer's voice rose. The youngest was perhaps 18, though it was hard to tell. Nasha, star child. She trembled against her chains like a wild horse feeling rope for the first time, terror and defiance warring across her face in equal measure. Her eyes were wide, white showing around the irises, but her jaw was set. She wouldn't cry, wouldn't give them that. Even as her knees threatened to buckle, even as her breath came in short, panicked gasps, she stood. The fear was there, anyone could see it, but so was something fiercer. A spark that refused to die even when logic said it should. The crowd numbered maybe 40 men. Outlaws with prices on their heads. Bounty hunters with blood under their fingernails. Settlers who'd grown cruel in the harsh territory, who'd convinced themselves that survival justified anything. They stood in the brutal afternoon sun, sweat darkening their shirts, dust settling on their shoulders like a judgment they couldn't feel. Some looked eager, others uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to leave. Money changed hands in quiet wagers. Speculation rippled through them like wind through dry grass. The auctioneer was a rail-thin man named Carver, known for his work moving stolen goods from Texas to California. He had a voice like gravel in a tin cup and eyes that never settled on anything long enough to care about it. He paced the platform, spitting tobacco juice between sentences, his hat tilted back to show a forehead sunburned red and peeling. The sisters had been taken 3 days prior from a small Apache camp in the Sacramento Mountains. Raiders working for mine owners who wanted the land cleared, who decided that removal by any means was easier than negotiation. The camp had been small, just extended family, hiding in the high country, trying to live the old ways while the world contracted around them. The men had been killed. The elderly left behind. The three young women bound and dragged north to Red Mesa, because men like Carver knew there was always a market for beauty and youth, especially when it came wrapped in exotic skin and defiant eyes. The bidding started low, insultingly low, as if these were livestock, broken tools, something used and disposable. Ayanna's jaw tightened with each called number, each casual assessment of their worth in dollars and cents. Nasha's trembling intensified. Only Kaya remained absolutely still, her gaze fixed on something in the distance that perhaps only she could see. The numbers climbed. $50, $75, $100 for all three. The crowd grew more animated. Men called out in voices thick with liquor and intention. They described what they'd do, how they'd use them, where they'd take them. The words were knives. The sisters felt each one. And then the bidding stalled. $150. The auctioneer cajoled, wheedled, promised quality and value. But the men had reached their limit, or perhaps their collective shame had finally found some shallow bottom to rest against. That's when he stepped forward, the rancher. No one in Red Mesa knew much about him. He'd arrived 6 months back, claimed a patch of hardscrabble land 15 miles south, near the base of the Diablos, and kept to himself. He was perhaps 40, though the sun and wind made such calculations difficult. Tall, lean in the way men become when they eat little and work hard. His face was weathered leather, lined around the eyes, stubbled with several days of beard gone gray at the edges. He wore the clothes of a working man: canvas pants, worn boots, a shirt that had been blue once, but had faded to the color of distant sky, a hat with a broken brim. No gun visible, though anyone with sense knew he'd have one somewhere. He moved through the crowd like water finding a path, neither pushing nor yielding, simply present and moving forward until he stood at the base of the platform. The other men parted for him, sensing something they couldn't quite name. Danger, maybe. Or just the kind of stillness that came from a man who'd already lost everything worth losing. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried. $300. The crowd went silent. It was more than twice the standing bid. More than these women could possibly be worth on any rational market. The auctioneer's eyes narrowed, sensing something off in this transaction. But greed was a powerful thing, and $300 was $300. Carver called for other bids, but the crowd had gone cold. Something about the rancher's presence, his stillness, the way his eyes never left the three women, made other men reconsider their desires. Or perhaps it was just the money hard to compete with a man willing to pay that much, going once, going twice. The rancher reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch. He counted bills onto the platform edge with careful precision, bills that represented months of work, sweat, and sacrifice. The sum total of everything he'd built since arriving in New Mexico. He laid it down like a man placing stones on a grave necessary, final, heavy with meaning. Sold. The word fell like an axe. Keys rattled. The auctioneer descended, unlocked the chains from the platform ring, and handed them to the rancher like he was passing over the reins to a horse. The sisters' shackles remained on their wrists, connected by short lengths of chain. Protocol, Carver said. Safety. In case they ran. The rancher took the chains. His hands were calloused, scarred, the hands of someone who'd worked leather and wood and knew the weight of responsibility. He looked at the three women for the first time since bidding, really looked at them, and something passed across his face that might have been sorrow or recognition or both. Ayanna stared back with pure hatred. Kaya's eyes were unreadable. Nasha looked like she might vomit or faint or both. The rancher turned without a word and began walking toward the edge of town where his horse and wagon waited. The chains went taut. The sisters had no choice but to follow, stumbling at first, then finding their footing in the dust. The crowd parted again, watching, some men grumbling, others relieved it was over, a few looking at the rancher like they were trying to memorize his face for future reference. The sun had reached its apex, turning the desert into a furnace. Heat waves danced above the packed earth. The sisters' bare feet found every sharp stone, every patch of scorching ground. They wore simple shift dresses, torn and filthy from days of captivity. Their hair hung loose and tangled. Sweat and dust had painted them in shades of brown and gray. The rancher's wagon was a simple flatbed affair, pulled by two sturdy horses that looked better fed than their owner. He stopped beside it, then did something unexpected. He set down the chains, reached into the wagon bed, and pulled out 3 canteens of water. He held them out. The sisters didn't move. Ayana's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Kaya watched his hands for weapons. Nasha just stared. The rancher's face revealed nothing. He simply waited, arm extended, canteens hanging from his fingers like an offering to uncertain gods. Finally, thirst won. Nasha broke first, lunging forward and snatching a canteen with both chained hands. She drank desperately, water spilling down her chin and neck. Kaya moved next, more controlled, taking measured swallows. Ayana waited longest, pride and practicality battling behind her eyes. But eventually, even she reached out and took the 3rd canteen. The rancher watched them drink. Then he climbed into the wagon bed, retrieved 3 blankets, rough wool but clean, and set them on the ground. He gestured to the wagon, to the blankets, then to the sisters. The meaning was clear. They could sit. They could cover themselves from the sun. They could have this small dignity. Ayana looked at him like he was a snake that might strike. But Nasha was already climbing into the wagon bed, pulling a blanket around her shoulders despite the heat, needing the barrier more than the comfort. Kaya followed. Ayana came last, never taking her eyes off the rancher, positioning herself between him and her sisters. The rancher climbed onto the driver's bench, took up the reins, and clicked his tongue. The horses leaned into their harnesses. The wagon lurched forward. Red Mesa began to fall behind them, swallowed by dust and distance and the kind of forgetting that deserts specialize in. They rode south into country that grew more broken with each mile. The road, such as it was, wound between mesas that rose like ancient fortresses, their stratified walls telling stories of vanished seas and time beyond human reckoning. Sagebrush dotted the hardpan. Occasional juniper trees twisted up from stone, gnarled survivors in a landscape designed to kill anything soft. The sisters sat in silence, swaying with the wagon's motion, trying to process what had happened and what might come next. In their world, men bought women for specific purposes. None of those purposes were good. The fact that this man had paid so much, had behaved so strangely, didn't comfort them. It made him more unpredictable, more dangerous in his inscrutability. Ayana's mind raced through scenarios and plans. She tested the chains subtly, feeling for weakness in the links, studying the landscape for escape routes. 15 miles, the distance to his ranch. In her bare feet in the desert with no water or supplies. Suicide, but staying might be worse. She'd die fighting before she'd submit. That much she knew about herself. Kaya watched the rancher's back. She noted how he held the reins, the slope of his shoulders, the fact that he never once looked back at them. She thought about trauma, about men who'd hurt her before, about whether violence was always loud or if sometimes it was quiet like this. She breathed slowly, counting each inhalation, using the technique she'd learned as a child when the world became too much. One breath, then another, then another. Survive this moment, then face the next. Nasha cried silently, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face. She was terrified in a way that her sister's hardness couldn't quite achieve. Young enough to still believe the world should be fair, old enough to know it wasn't. She wanted her mother, her father, the camp in the mountains, where morning mist settled in the pines and evening fires crackled with mesquite smoke. She wanted to go back to 3 days ago and run faster when the raiders came. She wanted to undo everything that had led to this moment in this wagon, with this silent stranger who owned them now by law, and custom and $300 counted onto a wooden platform. The sun moved across the sky like a judgment that couldn't be appealed. Shadows lengthened. Temperatures began their evening drop. The horses plodded steadily, knowing this route, requiring little guidance. The rancher's hands on the reins were loose, patient. Hours passed. The wagon swayed. Dust rose and settled. The landscape changed in subtle ways, more vegetation, signs of water somewhere beneath the surface. The Diablos loomed ahead, not truly mountains, but impressive enough in this flat country, their peaks touched with the gold of approaching sunset. Nasha eventually slept despite herself, exhaustion overcoming fear. Her head lolled against Kaya's shoulder. Kaya didn't move, becoming a pillow, a support, playing the role she'd always played, the middle, the bridge, the one who absorbed impact so others didn't have to. Ayana never slept. Her eyes stayed fixed on the rancher's back, memorizing, calculating, preparing. If he tried anything, she'd fight. If he sold them again, she'd run. If he killed them, she'd make sure he remembered it. These promises she made to herself over and over, a litany against powerlessness. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and crimson, the ranch came into view. It wasn't much. A small adobe house, thick-walled against the heat, its surface painted white but grayed by wind and time. A barn that leaned slightly south, weathered boards speaking of minimal maintenance, a corral with split-rail fencing, a well with a bucket and rope, a few outbuildings whose purposes were immediately clear. Everything spoke of functionality, of a man living alone and building only what was necessary for survival. The rancher pulled the wagon to a stop near the house. He set the brake, climbed down, and for the first time since Red Mesa, he spoke. His voice was rougher than before, like words were tools he'd forgotten how to use properly. He said they could sleep in the barn. There was hay, clean water. The door didn't lock from the outside. In the morning, he'd figure out what came next. Then he did this second unexpected thing. He pulled a key from his pocket, walked to the wagon, and unlocked the shackles from Ayana's wrists. The metal fell away. He moved to Kaya, repeated the action. Then Nasha. The chains lay in the wagon bed like shed skins. The sisters stared at their freed wrists, at the raw marks where iron had bitten, at this man who'd just given them back something they thought was lost. Ayana's hand moved instinctively to the red welts, touching them as if to confirm they were real, that the chains were truly gone. The rancher picked up the shackles and threw them into the well. They landed with a distant splash, swallowed by darkness and water, gone. He gestured toward the barn, then walked to the house and went inside without looking back. The door closed. A lamp flickered to life in the window. The three sisters stood in the gathering darkness, free and still captive, unchained but miles from anywhere, facing a night full of questions and a man who made no sense in their understanding of how the world worked. Ayana was the first to move. She climbed out of the wagon, her legs unsteady after hours of sitting, and began walking toward the barn. Not because he'd told her to, but because options were limited and shelter was shelter. Kaya helped Nasha down, supporting her younger sister's weight, and together they followed. The barn smelled of hay and horses and leather and dust. 2 stalls held the rancher's horses, now unsaddled and contentedly eating grain. The rest of the space was open hay bales stacked against one wall, tools hanging on another, a ladder leading to a loft overhead. And water as promised. A barrel filled to the brim, a dipper hanging on the side. Nasha drank first again, then Kaya, then Ayana. The water was cold, pulled recently from the well, tasting of minerals and earth and life. They climbed into the loft where the hay was piled deep. Nasha burrowed into it immediately, pulling armfuls over herself like a nest. Kaya sat at the edge, watching the barn entrance, the house beyond. Ayana paced for a while, restless energy finding no outlet, before finally settling near her sisters. The night came on fast the way it does in the desert. Stars emerged by the thousands, so many they seemed to layer upon each other, creating depths and distances that made the earth feel small. A coyote called somewhere in the darkness. Another answered. The horses below shifted in their stalls, hooves against packed dirt. In the house, the lamp burned for a while longer, then went dark. Nasha slept almost immediately, her young body demanding rest despite circumstances. Kaya dozed fitfully, waking at every sound. Ayana stayed awake until deep night, watching moonlight paint silver squares on the barn floor, thinking about their mother who was dead now, their father who'd been killed defending the camp there, younger brother who'd been shot trying to run, thinking about the chains at the bottom of the well, thinking about a man who paid $300 and asked for nothing in return. It made no sense. In her experience, men always wanted something. Always. She'd wait. She'd watch. And when his true nature revealed itself, because it always did, she'd be ready. But for now, despite everything, despite her vigilance and her rage and her fear, exhaustion finally claimed her too. She slept sitting up, back against a post, one hand near her side where a knife would be if she had one. The stars wheeled overhead. The desert breathed. The ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms. And in the house the rancher lay awake on a narrow bed, staring at ceiling beams he'd cut, and placed himself thinking about $300 he couldn't afford to spend, and 3 women he couldn't afford not to save. Thinking about choices and consequences, and whether a man could ever really outrun what he'd done before. The morning came cold and blue. Dawn in the high desert was like that, sudden, crisp, the temperature dropping overnight as heat fled into a cloudless sky. The sun rose behind the Diablos, painting the eastern slopes gold and leaving the valleys in purple shadow. The rancher was already awake. He'd slept badly, the way he always did, plagued by dreams of places and faces he tried not to think about during daylight hours. He dressed in the same clothes as yesterday, splashed water on his face from the basin on his table, and went outside to begin the morning work. He fed the chickens first. A small flock, maybe a dozen hens and 1 rooster who announced the dawn like he'd personally arranged it. Then the horses, measuring out grain with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much he had and how long it needed to last. He checked the well, lowered the bucket, pulled up fresh water. The chains he'd thrown in yesterday were invisible in the depths, already forgotten by everything except the people who'd worn them. He was filling a second bucket when he became aware of being watched. Ayana stood near the barn, arms crossed, eyes tracking his every movement. She'd positioned herself in morning shadow, instinctively choosing darkness over light, concealment over exposure. Her hair was wild from sleep, hay dust clinging to her clothes, but her bearing was regal. She looked like a princess of some exiled court, defiant in her poverty. The rancher nodded once, a small acknowledgement of her presence, and continued working. He carried the water bucket to the chicken coop, refreshed their trough, scattered more grain. The hens clucked and bustled, indifferent to human drama, interested only in their immediate needs. When he finished, he walked toward the house, passing within 10 feet of Ayana. She tensed, ready to fight or flee, but he simply walked past without pause and went inside. The door remained open behind him. Ayana waited, listening. She heard the scrape of a pot, the strike of a match, the crackle of a fire being laid in a stove. Breakfast sounds, domestic sounds, utterly ordinary and therefore deeply strange. Kaya emerged from the barn, then Nasha. The 3 sisters converged, speaking in low tones in their own language, discussing what to do. Ayana wanted to scout for escape routes. Kaya urged patience and observation. Nasha just wanted to know if there would be food because her stomach was eating itself. The decision was made for them when the rancher appeared in the doorway. He held a plate in each hand, simple pottery, chipped at the edges. On each plate, cornbread, still warm, beans, 3 eggs fried in bacon fat. More food than they'd seen in days. He set the plates on a bench outside the door, then went back inside and returned with a third. He placed it beside the others, along with 3 forks and 3 tin cups filled with water. Then he retreated into the house without a word, leaving the food unguarded, unclaimed. The sisters stared at the plates like they might contain poison or tricks or obligations that would cost more than hunger. But the food was real, and it smelled like heaven, and their bodies overrode their caution. They ate standing up, quickly, barely tasting it in their desperation. Nasha made small sounds of pleasure despite herself. Kaya ate methodically, chewing each bite thoroughly, making it last. Ayana ate fastest, driven by a need to finish before something could take it away. When they were done, they looked at each other, then at the house, then at the empty plates in their hands. After a moment's hesitation, Kaya carried the plates to the door and set them just inside the threshold. It wasn't thanks exactly, just acknowledgement, transaction without words. The day unfolded in a pattern that would repeat with variations for weeks to come. The rancher worked. He repaired a section of fence that had rotted. He mucked out the stalls. He rode out to check on a small herd of cattle he was running on scrubland to the east. He did all the 1,000 tasks that made up ranch life, that endless cycle of maintenance and survival that defined the frontier. The sisters watched and waited. They explored the property cautiously, testing boundaries, looking for weapons or supplies that might aid escape. They found little. The rancher kept no guns visible. His tools were too heavy to carry far. The nearest settlement was Red Mesa, 15 miles through country that would kill them, so they waited and watched and tried to understand. On the third day, the rancher brought out clothes, women's clothes simple but clean. A riding skirt and blouse for each of them, underthings, stockings, proper boots. He left them on the bench and went back to work. The clothes fit well enough, not perfectly but close. Like he'd paid attention to their sizes, had thought about this, had planned. On the 5th day, he brought out a box of supplies. Soap, a comb, needles and thread, a small mirror. Things for basic dignity and self-care. Again, no words. Just the items left where they could be found. On the 8th day, Nasha fell ill. Nothing serious, just a cold that had been building since Red Mesa, finally catching up with her weakened system. She developed a fever, began coughing. Kaya tended her in the barn, using techniques their mother had taught: cool water, rest, time. The rancher noticed. That evening, he approached the barn for the first time since they'd arrived. He stopped at the entrance, not entering their space, and held out a bottle. Willow bark tea, already brewed. And a jar of honey to cut the bitterness. Kaya took them after a moment's hesitation. Their eyes met. She saw something in his face, then concern, but also distance. Like he was helping, but couldn't afford to care too much. Like he was holding himself apart deliberately. The medicine helped. Nasha's fever broke that night. By morning she was weak but recovering, asking for food, complaining about boredom. Her sisters traded small smiles. She'd be fine. Ayana began to reevaluate. Not trust, she wasn't capable of that anymore, might never be again. But she recategorized. This man wasn't a typical threat. He was something else. Something she lacked framework to understand. She started watching him differently. Not for signs of aggression, but for clues to his character. She noticed how he worked efficiently, but without hurry, like he had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. She saw how he treated his animals, not cruelly but not sentimentally either, just with the practical care of someone who understood they were partners in survival. She observed that he never came to the barn uninvited, never watched them in ways that made her skin crawl, never asked for anything or implied that their debt needed repayment. It confused her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she could fight. This? She had no weapons against basic human decency. 2 weeks became 3. The sisters developed a routine. They woke with the sun, washed at the barn's water barrel, dressed. Breakfast appeared on the bench. They ate. The rancher worked. They occupied themselves talking, resting, gradually exploring further from the ranch buildings. Nasha found a lizard and named it. Kaya started a small garden near the barn, using seeds from kitchen scraps, transplanting wild grasses that might grow into something useful. Ayanna sat on the corral fence and watched the horizon, planning escapes she never executed. The rancher continued his silent routine. He provided food, ensured they had what they needed, and maintained his distance. At night, his lamp burned briefly, then darkness. In the morning he was up before them, already working. It was strange. It was uncomfortable. It was the safest they'd felt since the raiders came. But safety wasn't freedom. The sisters knew they were still prisoners of circumstance, even without chains. They had nowhere to go, no resources, no family to return to. The world beyond the ranch was as hostile as ever, maybe more so now that they'd been marked as sold property, merchandise that some men would feel entitled to reclaim. On the 20th day, riders appeared. It was mid-morning. The rancher was out checking fences. The sisters were near the barn, Nasha tending her lizard, Kaya weeding her small garden, Ayanna keeping watch as always. She saw them first. 3 men on horseback, coming from the north, raising dust, moving with purpose. She recognized the posture, the approach. These weren't travelers. They were coming here specifically. Her warning cry brought her sisters running. They retreated to the barn, Ayanna positioning herself at the door, looking for weapons. A pitchfork, a shovel. Better than nothing. The riders reached the ranch and stopped near the house. They dismounted, looking around with the proprietary air of men who believed they owned whatever their eyes touched. One of them had been at the auction. Ayanna recognized him, a bounty hunter named Reese, built like a bull, face scarred from smallpox, eyes that held no light. They called out, their voices carrying. They were looking for the rancher. Had business with him, wanted to discuss his purchase. The rancher appeared from around the barn, leading his horse, having cut his patrol short at the sight of visitors. He didn't hurry, didn't show concern, just walked steadily forward until he stood between the riders and the barn where the sisters hid. The men arranged themselves to form a loose semicircle. Predators cornering prey. Reese did the talking. He'd come, he said, to make an offer. $500 for the 3 women, more than the rancher paid. Good profit for a few weeks' work. Everyone wins. The rancher didn't respond immediately. He stood with his weight balanced, hands loose at his sides, absolutely still in the way that dangerous men sometimes are right before violence. When he spoke, his voice carried that same quiet quality, but underneath it was something else. Something that made the horses shift nervously. He said the women weren't for sale. Reese smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. He said that was disappointing. He'd hoped to do this friendly-like. He explained that the women were valuable property, that other buyers had emerged, that there was a market for such things. He suggested the rancher was in over his head. Suggested it would be safer to take the money. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke. The rancher's expression didn't change. He repeated himself, slower this time, making sure every word landed. Not for sale. The tension ratcheted up. Reese's companion shifted, hands moving toward weapons. The morning sun beat down. Somewhere a crow called. The moment stretched, pulling tight. Then Reese shrugged, all false casualness. He said they'd tried the easy way. Said the rancher should think about it. Said they'd be back in 3 days for his final answer. Said it would be a shame if something happened to his nice ranch, his animals, his peace. The threat was unsubtle. The men mounted up and rode out, taking their time, making sure everyone understood they weren't afraid, weren't deterred, would return exactly when they said. When they were out of sight, the rancher stood for a long time watching the horizon. Then he turned and looked at the barn. At the 3 faces visible in the shadows just inside the door. His face showed something then. Not fear exactly. More like acceptance. Like a man who'd known this was coming, had made his choices anyway, and would now live with the consequences. He walked to the house and went inside. When he emerged, he was carrying a rifle, a Winchester repeater, well-maintained, deadly. He checked the action, loaded it, and set it by the door. Then he brought out a shotgun, did the same. then a revolver which he strapped to his hip. The message was clear. The time for pretending this could end peacefully was over. The sisters came out of the barn slowly. Ayanna approached, Kaya and Nasha behind her. They stopped a few yards from him, this strange man who'd bought them and fed them and asked for nothing and was now preparing to fight for them. Ayanna spoke for the first time in his presence. Her English was accented but clear, each word carefully chosen. She asked why. Why buy them? Why free them? Why fight for them? Why any of it? They were nothing to him. Strangers. The world was full of suffering, and he couldn't save everyone. Why them? Why this? The rancher was quiet for a long moment. When he answered, his voice was rougher than usual, like the words cost something to extract. He said he'd had a daughter once. Said she'd been 14 when the cholera took her. Said he'd been away at the time, fighting in a war he didn't believe in, killing people he didn't hate. Said he'd returned to a grave and a wife who wouldn't look at him anymore, because he'd chosen duty over family, and their daughter had died without him. He said he'd spent the years since trying to figure out how to live with that. Said he'd failed mostly. Said he'd done things he wasn't proud of. Said he'd seen women and children hurt in ways that haunted him. He said when he saw them on that platform, chained and terrified, he saw his daughter, saw what could have happened to her, saw all the times he'd looked away when he should have acted. He said he couldn't save his daughter, couldn't change his past. But he could do this one thing, right now, today, for them. He said it wasn't about them personally. It was about being able to look at himself in a mirror and not see a coward. He said they were free to leave. He wouldn't stop them. But if they stayed, he'd do what he could to protect them. Not because he expected anything in return, just because it was right. And he was tired of doing things that weren't. Then he picked up the rifle and walked away to continue preparing, leaving them with his truth laid bare. The sisters stood in the sun, processing what they'd heard. Nasha was crying silently. Kaya looked thoughtful, pieces clicking into place. Ayanna felt something crack in her chest, some armor she'd built starting to show fissures. They could leave. Should leave, probably. This wasn't their fight. This man's redemption wasn't worth their lives. But where would they go? The world beyond this ranch was full of men like Reese. Men worse than Reese. At least here, they had someone willing to stand between them and that world. At least here, they mattered to someone, even if only as symbols of his dead daughter, his lost chance at being a better man. At least here, they weren't alone. Ayanna made a decision. She walked to the barn and found the tools she'd been eyeing for weeks. The hammer, the nails, the boards stacked in the corner. She carried them out and began boarding up the barn windows, leaving only small gaps for light and air. Making it defensible, Kaya understood immediately. She began gathering water, food, medical supplies, anything they might need if things went bad, creating a cache, a survival store. Nasha, too young to help with preparations, took on the job of lookout. She climbed to the barn loft and positioned herself at the high window facing north, watching for dust clouds, for riders, for trouble. They worked through the day. The rancher saw what they were doing and didn't stop them. Instead, he brought them things: more boards, a second rifle and ammunition for it, a medical kit with bandages and antiseptics. He showed Kaya how to load the rifle, how to aim, how to breathe and squeeze rather than pull. She was a quick study, her observant nature translating well to the mechanics of firearms. He showed Ayanna too, though she already seemed to understand weapons through instinct more than instruction. By sunset, the ranch had transformed. The barn was fortified, windows covered, a clear line of sight to any approach. The house had been similarly prepared. Water barrels positioned strategically. Food stored where it could be accessed quickly. Ammunition counted and distributed. The corral gate left open so the horses could flee if things went bad. No sense in them dying too. The rancher cooked a larger meal than usual that evening. Venison stew with potatoes and wild onions, biscuits baked in his Dutch oven, coffee strong enough to strip paint. He brought it out to the barn rather than leaving it on the bench, actually entering their space for only the second time since they'd arrived. They ate together in the barn's dim interior, lamplight casting long shadows, the smell of food mixing with hay and horse and leather. It felt like the Last Supper, though no one said it. Nasha ate quickly, nervously. Kaya ate steadily, thinking. Ayana barely touched her food, too wired with anticipation and fear to feel hunger. The rancher told them the plan, such as it was. When Reese returned, they'd see if money could still solve this. He'd offer to buy their safety, pay the men to leave, forget they'd ever been here. If that worked, good. If not, they'd fight. The sisters would stay in the barn, protected by its walls. He'd take the house, create a crossfire if needed. The goal was survival, not glory. If an opening appeared to run, they should take it. Ayana asked what happened after. If they survived. If Reese's people didn't keep coming, didn't track them down. The rancher admitted he didn't know. Maybe they'd go north, to Colorado territory where law still meant something. Maybe south to Mexico where they could disappear. Maybe they'd just keep running until running didn't work anymore. He wasn't good at long-term planning. Never had been. He lived day to day, moment to moment, trying to do the next right thing and hoping it added up to something worthwhile. It wasn't reassuring exactly, but it was honest. The sisters appreciated that. After the meal, the rancher returned to the house. The lamp in his window burned late into the night. He was writing, they realized later, letters. One to his ex-wife probably. One to the land office. One to a sister back east. Settling accounts in case he didn't get another chance. The sisters tried to sleep but couldn't manage much. They talked quietly in the darkness, in their own language, about life and death and choices. Nasha asked if they should have run that first night, should have taken their chances in the desert. Kaya said no, they'd be dead by now, or worse, back on an auction block somewhere else. Ayana said it didn't matter anymore. They were here. This was happening. They'd face it together. The night passed slowly. The stars wheeled. Coyotes sang their evening chorus. The desert breathed its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human drama, having seen a million such conflicts play out across millennia and knowing it would see a million more. Dawn came gray and cool, clouds building in the east, promising rain that might or might not come. The rancher was up early, checking everything again, weapons loaded, water accessible, sight lines clear. He moved with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this before, who'd prepared for violence and known its aftermath. The sisters were awake too, restless, nervous. They checked their own preparations, rehearsed positions, tried to remember everything he'd taught them about the rifles. Nasha threw up from nerves. Kaya held her hair back, murmured comfort. Ayana paced like a caged animal. The first day passed without incident. And the second, Reese had said 3 days. Maybe he'd been bluffing. Maybe he'd decided it wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe he'd found easier prey. They didn't believe it, but they hoped. On the morning of the third day, Nasha called out from the loft. Riders coming. Multiple riders, more than before. The rancher emerged from the house, rifle in hand, and looked north. His face hardened. He counted silently, lips moving. 7 men. Reese had brought reinforcements. He turned to the barn and gave a single sharp nod. It was happening. No more waiting. The sisters moved to their positions. Kaya by the north-facing gap they'd left in the boards, rifle ready. Ayana by the east side, covering the approach to the house. Nasha deep in the barn with extra ammunition and the medical supplies, ready to reload, ready to help however she could. The rancher walked to the middle of the yard between house and barn, planted himself there like a tree, and waited. The 7 riders came in slowly, spreading out as they approached, surrounding the ranch from multiple angles, professional. These weren't all bounty hunters. Some were guns for hire, men who killed for wages and asked no questions. Reese had spent money on this, brought in real talent. They stopped about 50 yards out, horses shifting beneath them, dust settling. Reese sat his mount front and center, that bull-like physique unmistakable. He was smiling. His voice carried across the distance, jovial, mocking. He asked if the rancher had considered his offer, said time was up. Said this could still end friendly-like if the rancher was smart. The rancher stood silent, rifle held loosely across his chest, thumb on the hammer. Reese's smile faded. He said fine, they'd do it the hard way. Said he'd give one more chance though, because he was generous. Said to bring out the women, hand them over, and he'd let the rancher live. Keep his ranch, keep his pride, keep his life. Just the women. That's all he wanted. The rancher's response was quiet, but clear, each word deliberate. He said no. Reese sighed like he was disappointed but not surprised. He said he'd hoped the rancher would be reasonable. Said what happened next was on him. Said he'd given every chance. Then he nodded to his men, and all hell broke loose. The first shot came from one of the hired guns, a rifle crack that split the morning. The bullet kicked up dirt 3 feet from the rancher. He dove and rolled, came up behind a water trough, returned fire. His shot took the shooter in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The other riders scattered, seeking cover, their horses panicking. Shots came from multiple directions, from behind the corral fence, from a small rise to the east, from near the barn. They'd positioned themselves well, created a killing field. The rancher fired methodically, not wasting ammunition, each shot calculated. He hit another man in the leg, dropped a horse that screamed and thrashed. But he was pinned, couldn't move without exposing himself to multiple angles. That's when Kaya fired from the barn. Her shot went wide, but close enough to make the man behind the corral flinch and relocate. Ayanna fired next, better aimed, hitting the wood near another attacker's head, sending splinters flying. The dynamic shifted. Reese's men realized they weren't just facing one man. Realized the women were armed and willing to fight. Realized this wasn't going to be the easy raid they'd anticipated. Reese shouted orders, directing his men to focus fire on the barn. Bullets thudded into the heavy adobe walls, punched through gaps in the boards. The sisters ducked low, hearts hammering, ears ringing from the confined space, amplifying every sound. The rancher used the distraction to move, sprinting from the trough to the corner of the house. He fired twice from the new angle, hitting one man in the chest, dropping him. 5 attackers left, but they were spread out now, harder to target. The fight settled into a grim exchange, shots and return fire. Long pauses as both sides assessed positions. The smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Wounded men groaning. Horses fled to the far end of the property, spooked beyond calming. Nasha reloaded rifles with shaking hands, passing them to her sisters. Cartridges spilled from her fingers in her haste. Kaya fired with mechanical precision. 3 shots, reload, 3 more. Ayanna burned with fierce concentration, her every shot an act of defiance, a declaration that she would not be taken again. An hour passed. Then too, the clouds that had threatened rain broke, pouring water that turned dust to mud, made visibility difficult, added misery to an already miserable situation. Everyone was soaked within minutes. Gunpowder got wet, some rounds misfired. The rancher's hat flew off, carried away by wind. He didn't retrieve it. One of Reese's men tried to rush the barn during a lull, thinking he could cross the distance before anyone could draw a bead. Ayanna shot him midway across the yard. He went down clutching his leg, screaming. 2 of his companions dragged him back behind cover, leaving a blood trail in the mud. The rain stopped as suddenly as it started. The sun broke through, turning the ranch into a steaming sauna, everything dripping and glistening. 4 attackers left active, plus the wounded man. But the defenders were running low on ammunition. The rancher had maybe 24 rounds left, the sisters fewer. Reese knew it too. He called out, offering terms again. Said they'd fought well, earned respect. Said he'd take just 1 woman, his choice, and leave the rest. said that was the best deal they'd get. The rancher's response was another shot, close enough to Reese's head that he felt the wind of its passing. Reese's patience finally broke. He stood fully upright behind his cover, exposing himself in his anger, and shouted that they were all dead. Every single one. He'd burn them out, shoot them as they ran, make examples of them. He'd been merciful before, but mercy time was over. That's when the second set of riders appeared. They came from the south, moving fast, 8 men on good horses. For a moment, no one knew whose side they were on, reinforcements for Reese, or something else entirely. Everyone froze, watching, waiting. Then one of the new riders fired, and his shot hit one of Reese's men. The sides became clear. The rancher recognized the leader, a man named Jubal, owner of the next ranch over, 15 miles south. They'd met once, shared water during a dry spell, exchanged brief conversation. Not friends exactly, but neighbors in the way frontier people understood the term. People who helped because out here, you never knew when you'd need helping in turn. Jubal had heard the gunfire, seen the smoke. He'd gathered what men he could, ranch hands, a couple of drifters, his own 2 sons, and come to investigate. Seeing the situation, he'd made his choice. The arrival of 8 fresh fighters changed everything. Reese's remaining men broke immediately, running for their horses, abandoning positions, thinking only of escape. Reese himself hesitated, pride and anger warring with survival instinct. The rancher stood from cover, rifle aimed, and Reese saw his face. Saw that this man would kill him given the chance, would do it without hesitation or regret. Saw his own death written there. Reese ran. Mounted his horse and spurred it hard, racing north, leaving wounded men behind, leaving his reputation in tatters. The last man still fighting took one look at the odds, threw down his weapon, and raised his hands in surrender. The silence after the gunfire was profound. Ears rang. Smoke drifted. The smell of blood and cordite hung heavy. Everyone breathed hard, adrenaline still flooding systems that hadn't caught up to the fact that the fighting was over. Jubal dismounted and walked toward the rancher, hand extended. They shook, 2 men who'd survived violence together, who'd chosen the hard right over the easy wrong. Jubal's men secured the wounded, disarmed the surrendering attacker, checked the dead. 3 dead, 2 wounded badly enough they might not make it. The ranch yard looked like a battlefield, scarred by bullets, blood mixing with mud. The morning's peace shattered into something that might never fully heal. The sisters emerged from the barn slowly, weapons still held ready, not quite believing it was over. Nasha was crying openly now, all the terror and adrenaline pouring out. Kaya moved stiffly, her body locked with tension that would take hours to release. Ayana looked fierce and lost and small all at once, the armor she'd built cracking to reveal the frightened young woman beneath. The rancher walked to them, and for the first time, he reached out. He placed a hand on Ayana's shoulder, just a brief touch, a connection. Then Kaya's. Then he pulled Nasha into an awkward, unpracticed embrace while she sobbed against his chest. They'd survived. Together, that had to count for something. Jubal's men helped clean up, helped bury the dead in graves scratched into hard ground beyond the property line. They tended the wounded as best they could before loading them onto a wagon to be transported to Red Mesa for trial or treatment or both. The surrendering man told everything, Reese's plans, his connections, his intention to sell the sisters south into territories where law was even weaker and women disappeared without trace. The testimony would be enough to put warrants out, to make Reese a hunted man, to perhaps bring some small measure of justice to a situation that had precious little. As the sun set on that long, terrible day, Jubal and his men prepared to leave. But before going, Jubal pulled the rancher aside. He said he'd heard stories now, pieced together the situation from the wounded men's babbling. Said the whole territory would hear about it soon. 3 Apache women, a rancher who'd stood against the world for them, a siege that ended with Reese running scared. He said that story would travel. Said it would bring attention, Some good, some bad. Said men like Reese had friends and employers who wouldn't appreciate the embarrassment. Said the ranch might never be safe again, not really. He said his wife's sister lived in Colorado Springs. Said she ran a boarding house for working women, a respectable place, protected by actual law. Said he could write a letter, make introductions. Said if the sisters wanted a fresh start somewhere safer, somewhere they could build real lives, he'd help make it happen. The rancher listened, then looked toward the barn where the sisters were helping tend wounds, boil water, do the practical work that needed doing after violence. He'd never asked them what they wanted long-term. Had always assumed their presence was temporary, that they'd leave when opportunity arose. Had tried not to think about how empty the ranch would feel when they were gone. He said he'd tell them. Let them choose. That night, after Jubal and his men had departed, after the dead were buried and the wounded transported and the ranch was theirs again, the four of them sat together in the barn. The lamp burned low. The horses shuffled in their stalls, uneasy after the day's violence but settling. Outside, the desert night was calm, stars emerging like promises of normalcy returning. The rancher told them about Jubal's offer, Colorado Springs. A respectable boarding house, protection, a chance to build lives without looking over their shoulders constantly. A chance to be something other than property or victims or symbols of someone else's redemption. He told them without advocacy, without pressure. Just presented it as fact, as option, as door that could be opened if they chose. He told them they'd earned the right to choose, had fought for it, literally, had proven they were warriors as much as victims, survivors as much as refugees. Whatever they decided, he'd support. He'd give them money for travel, write letters of introduction, do whatever was needed to set them up for success. And if they chose to stay, he'd do his best to protect them. But he was one man on an isolated ranch, and today had proven how vulnerable that made them. He couldn't promise safety, couldn't promise tomorrow, could only promise effort. The sisters listened in silence. Then they asked him what he wanted. What would make him happy? The question caught him off guard. No one had asked him that in years. He didn't know if he remembered how to be happy, how to want something beyond simple survival and the absence of guilt. He said he wanted them safe, wanted them to have chances he couldn't provide, wanted them to live full lives, not half-lives spent in fear, wanted to know he'd done something good, something that mattered, even if it ended with being alone again. He said their presence had changed him, had given him purpose beyond maintenance and memory, had reminded him what it felt like to be needed, to matter, to be worth something beyond his own narrow existence. But he wasn't fool enough to think that meant they owed him anything. Gratitude wasn't obligation. Being saved wasn't the same as being bound. Nasha spoke first. She said she wanted to learn to read English, wanted to understand contracts and laws so no one could ever trick her with words she didn't know. Wanted education, opportunity, a chance to be someone who helped others the way they'd been helped. Kaya spoke next. She said she wanted peace, wanted mornings without fear, wanted to heal from things she didn't talk about, traumas she carried in silence, wanted to find out who she was when survival wasn't the only priority. Ayana spoke last. She said she wanted revenge, wanted to hunt Reese down, make him pay, make sure he never hurt another woman. But she also said she wanted her sisters safe more than she wanted vengeance. Said she'd spent too much life being angry, and it was exhausting. Sighed maybe it was time to try something different. Said she didn't trust easily, might never fully trust anyone, but if she was going to try, this man had earned that attempt. They talked through the night, discussing options, weighing risks, examining possibilities. The conversation circled and evolved, touched on practical concerns and emotional needs, on past trauma and future hope. By dawn, they'd made their decision. They'd go to Colorado Springs, would take the chance Jubal offered, would try to build real lives, legal lives, lives where they controlled their own destinies. But they'd do it as family, all four of them, the rancher too. Because he'd saved them not just once but continuously, and because he needed saving as much as they did, even if he couldn't admit it. He resisted at first. Said the ranch was his responsibility, his penance, his place. Said he'd built something here and walking away felt like giving up, like running. Ayanna told him there was no penance left to pay. He'd balanced whatever scales needed balancing. His daughter would forgive him if she could. His ex-wife might never, but that was her burden, not his. He'd done enough, been enough. It was time to let himself be saved too. Kaya said they weren't asking for a father. Their father was dead, could never be replaced. They were offering partnership. Family by choice rather than blood. They'd take care of each other, the way people should, the way the world rarely allowed. Nasha said she'd named her lizard after him. That probably didn't mean much, but it meant something to her. She wanted him there to see her learn to read, to see what she'd become. She'd lost enough people. Didn't want to lose another. The ranchers sat with their words, with their offer, with the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by isolation and regret. It felt too good, too easy, like cheating somehow. But maybe that was the point. Maybe redemption wasn't supposed to hurt forever. Maybe at some point you were allowed to stop punishing yourself and just live. He said yes. The preparation took 2 weeks. The rancher sold what he could, the cattle, the land to a speculator who planned to subdivide it, the farm equipment to Jubal, who paid fair price and asked no questions. The horses they kept would need them for travel. The chickens went to a Mexican family who lived in a small settlement to the east, along with most of the furniture and household goods. The rancher kept only what mattered: his rifle, his father's watch, a few books, letters from his daughter that he'd never been able to throw away. The sisters packed their few possessions, the clothes he'd given them, Kaya's seeds from her small garden, Nasha's lizard in a ventilated box, Ayanna's growing collection of stones from around the ranch property, mementos of the place that had been their first real home in American territory. Jubal wrote the promised letters. The rancher wrote to his sister back east, to his ex-wife, explaining what he was doing and why. He left the deed to the ranch at the land office with instructions that if the sale fell through, it should go to Jubal for whatever price he felt was fair. On the morning of departure, they stood together looking at the small adobe house, the leaning barn, the corral fence, the well where chains rested at the bottom in eternal darkness. The place looked abandoned already, emptied of the life that had briefly filled it. They'd survived here, fought here, become something new here. The ranch would fade and crumble eventually, return to desert, be forgotten by everyone except the 4 of them. But for this moment, it existed as a monument to the fact that sometimes, against all odds, people chose to be better than circumstances demanded. Sometimes they chose courage over comfort, connection over isolation, hope over despair. Sometimes they chose each other. The journey north took 12 days. They traveled carefully, avoiding major settlements, sticking to lesser trails. Word had spread about the fight at the ranch, about Reese's humiliation, about the 3 Apache sisters and their unlikely protector. Some saw them as heroes, others as troublemakers. They didn't linger long enough to find out which. They camped under stars, cooked over small fires, told stories from their different lives. The rancher spoke of his daughter, of happy memories before the war, of regrets that he was learning to carry lighter. Nasha told stories her grandmother had told her about Coyote and the stars, about how the world began and might end. Kaya spoke least but laughed most, finding joy in small things, the way firelight danced, the taste of coffee in the morning, the sound of her sisters' voices filling silence. Ayanna rode scout, always alert, always protecting. But gradually, over days and miles, she softened, let others take watch sometimes. Slept without a weapon in her hand. Started to believe that maybe, possibly, they might actually make it. That the future might be something other than a threat to prepare for. They crossed into Colorado territory on a morning when frost painted the grass silver and their breath made clouds in crisp air. The mountains rose ahead of them, the Rockies massive and eternal, making human concern seem small by comparison. They stopped at the border, all four of them, and acknowledged the transition. They were leaving behind the worst of what had been, moving toward the uncertainty of what might be. Colorado Springs sprawled in the shadow of Pikes Peak, a growing town where civilization was still rough around the edges but present, where law existed and generally enforced itself, where women could own property and testimony meant something. The boarding house. Jubal, as sister-in-law ran, sat on a respectable street near the center of town, a large two-story structure painted white with green shutters, flower boxes already showing autumn colors, a sign that read simply Mrs. Hartwell's. Mrs. Hartwell herself was a widow of 50 with steel-gray hair, sharp eyes, and a no-nonsense demeanor that masked a fundamentally kind heart. She read Jubal's letter, looked at the four travel-worn individuals on her porch, and made her assessment in about 30 seconds. She said they looked like they'd been through hell, said she had rooms available if they had money, said house rules were strict, no drinking, no gambling, no bringing trouble to her door, said if they could follow those rules, they were welcome. The rancher paid for 3 months in advance, rooms for the sisters and one for himself. Mrs. Hartwell raised an eyebrow at the arrangement but said nothing. She'd seen stranger things. The sisters settled into a large room on the second floor, 3 beds, a washstand, a window that looked toward the mountains. It was the finest accommodations they'd ever had. Clean sheets, privacy, safety. Nasha cried again, but this time from relief and joy. Kaya stood at the window for an hour, just looking, breathing, existing without fear. Ayana tested the door lock 3 times before she believed it worked. The rancher took a smaller room down the hall, barely more than a closet, but it had a bed and a table and a chair, and that was enough. He lay on the mattress that first night and realized he hadn't slept in a real bed in over a year. The ranch had been a cot and rough blankets. Before that, a decade of sleeping rough, moving constantly, running from himself. Here, finally, he could stop running. The first weeks in Colorado Springs were about adjustment. The sisters registered with the local school, Nasha enthusiastically, the older two with more reluctance. They learned to navigate town, to shop in stores where they were customers not property, to walk streets without fear of being grabbed or claimed. They faced prejudice, certainly, stares and whispers and occasional slurs. But they also found kindness. Mrs. Hartwell became a fierce advocate, shutting down gossip with withering looks and pointed comments. Other women at the boarding house, seamstresses and teachers and clerks became friends, allies, sisters of a different sort. The rancher found work at a stable, mucking stalls and training horses. It was humble employment for a man his age, but honest and sufficient. He saved carefully, planning for the sisters' futures, for education and opportunities, and whatever dreams they might develop. He saw them at dinner each night, all the residents of Mrs. Hartwell's gathering at a long table, sharing food and conversation, and the small intimacies of communal living. It was more family than he'd had in 20 years. It felt strange and wonderful, and sometimes overwhelmingly bittersweet. Months passed. Winter came, deep and cold, the mountains white with snow. The sisters thrived. Nasha learned to read with fierce determination, devouring books, asking endless questions. Kaya found work at an apothecary, her careful nature and gentle manner perfect for measuring medicines and helping customers. Ayana struggled most with civilization-esque constraints, but eventually found her place teaching self-defense to women at a local church, channeling her warrior spirit into protection of others. They made lives, real lives, the kind they'd never imagined possible. The rancher watched them grow into themselves and felt the last of his guilt ease. He'd done something good, something that mattered. His daughter was gone, forever beyond his reach or redemption. But these 3 young women lived, thrived, became who they were meant to be. It wasn't the same. could never be the same. But it was something, it was enough. On the anniversary of their arrival in Colorado Springs, the four of them walked to the edge of town where the prairie met the mountains. They stood together looking back at the settlement, at the life they'd built, at the future stretching ahead unknown and full of possibility. Nasha had brought the box containing her lizard, no longer small, grown fat and lazy on a diet of beetles and affection. She opened it and let the creature go, watching it scurry into the grass toward whatever wild future it might find. Kaya scattered seeds from her pocket, descendants of the plants she'd grown at the ranch, letting them fall where they might take root and grow. Ayana placed a stone from her collection on a flat rock, marking this place, this moment, this transition from who they'd been to who they were becoming. The rancher just stood with them, hands in his pockets, breathing crisp mountain air, feeling sunlight on his face and the presence of chosen family beside him. He thought about the auction block in Red Mesa, the chains at the bottom of a well, the siege that had almost ended everything, the journey north through country that had tried to break them. He thought about choices and consequences and the way life rarely gave clear answers, about whether you were doing right or wrong. You just chose, again and again, and hoped that when you added it all up, you'd landed more on the side of good than evil. They'd survived. All four of them, together, that was its own kind of redemption. As they turned to walk back to town, back to Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, and the lives they were building, Ayana spoke. Her words were simple but carried the weight of everything they'd been through, everything they'd overcome. She said they were free, finally, truly free. Not because someone had granted it, or because they'd escaped, or because papers somewhere said so, but because they'd chosen it, fought for it, earned it with blood and courage and the decision to keep standing when falling would have been easier. She said freedom wasn't a place or a document. It was a state of being. And they'd found it together, three Apache sisters and a broken rancher who saved each other in ways that had nothing to do with money or ownership or the simple transaction of buying and selling human lives. She said they were family now, by choice, by trial, by the shared knowledge that they'd walked through fire and come out whole on the other side. The rancher nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Nasha slipped her hand into his, comfortable and trusting. Kaya smiled, quiet and content. They walked back toward Colorado Springs as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that had no names, only beauty. Behind them, the prairie stretched endless toward New Mexico, toward Red Mesa and the ranch and everything they'd left behind. Ahead, the town waited with its promise of tomorrow and the day after and all the days that would come, each one a gift they'd earned the right to unwrap. The story of three Apache sisters and the man who bought their freedom for $300 would be told for years throughout the territory. It would grow in the telling, become legend, be embellished and altered until it barely resembled truth. People would argue about details, about motivations, about whether it had happened at all or was just another frontier myth. But for the four people who'd lived it, the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend could capture. They'd found each other at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible circumstances, and had decided that mercy was possible, that kindness could exist even in brutal places, that family could be built from fragments and strangers, and shared trauma. They'd learned that redemption wasn't something you found. It was something you made, day by day, choice by choice, until the weight you'd been carrying became bearable and the future stopped looking like a threat. They'd learned that no one was beyond saving, no one was beyond starting again. And they'd learned that sometimes, in the vast and different desert of human existence, four broken people could find each other and become whole. The night settled over Colorado Springs, cool and clear and full of stars. In Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, four people who'd survived the unsurvivable sat down to dinner with their chosen family, grateful for the day they'd had and hopeful for the ones to come. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be more prejudice to face, more adjustments to make, more growth and change and struggle. The wounds they carried, physical and otherwise, would take time to heal, some never healing completely. But tonight, they were safe. They were together. They were free. And that was enough.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.